When I imagine the Israelites wandering around the desert and waiting for the time that they'll be allowed to enter the promised land, I think of what paradise might look like. I think about what it would mean to cross over the river and to be met with paradise. For each of you, it will look like something different. Maybe it's a white sandy beach with palm trees. Maybe it's a ski resort that it snows all year round. For me, it might look something like this. Beautiful valley treed with wild game and this lovely waterfall. But our story for today, which goes by almost before you can realize it's a story, is an important moment in the life of the Israelite people. And it talks about this moment where they enter the promised land, where they're first fed. But it's not at all what I expect when I think of paradise. So here's the story again. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt." And so that place is called Gilgal to this day. When the Israelites were camped in Gilgal, they kept Passover in the evening on the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on that day. They ate the produce of the land, and the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. As narrative stories go, this is a terrible story. Like, there's no beginning, middle, and end. It's just like, wait, there's like fact-checking almost. The people have been eating manna for 40 years, it is said. When you hear the word 40, it means a long time. 40 years of eating exactly the same thing, or at least the story goes. They come into this new land, and now, for the first time, they're eating produce. But I have a question for you. Whose produce are they eating? Because when you look back at the 5 chapters since they've crossed over to this promised land, there's been no example of them planting any seeds. Now, if all you'd done was eat manna for 40 years, you'd think that the seed planting of your crops would be an important detail to include in the story. But it's not there. So whose crops are they eating? One possibility for this is that they're eating the crops that they forage off the land. They come into a land and they find some wild mushrooms and blackberries are in season and there's a herd of wild deer running through and they forage. But we know from the first 4 chapters in the book of Joshua that there are other people in this land. So I think a much more likely possibility is that they've come into the land and they've kicked everyone off of it, and now they're eating the produce of the people who were once there. Does that make sense? They come in and it's right away they're eating the lettuce and the beans and the squash. They're not waiting the 60 days for the lettuce. They're not waiting the 90 days for the beans. They're not waiting the 120 days for the squash. They're just eating. Something is happening in this story. So what will we make of it? A bigger question also comes out of this story, which is, how do we understand our sacred texts when they seem to condone colonialism, genocide, and displacement? If you read the Bible, starting in Genesis, going all the way through to at least the end of Judges, you find a lot of stories of colonialism, displacement, and even genocide. Many people I know who read these texts, it's a stumbling block for them, and it is a stumbling block for me as well. Obviously, I don't think we condone any of these things. So let's see if we can unpack it and see what's there. First, we need to begin with an idea we introduced a couple of weeks ago. The idea that children or wealth or victory in battle means will, favor, blessing of the gods. So we talked about this with Abram, right? We had Abram, he didn't have children, and that was seen as something had gone wrong. That he didn't have kids, and there was a reason that God didn't want him to have kids. Well, the same holds true for wealth. There was this idea, and there still is, it still perpetuates, that if you have lots of wealth, that you have somehow been gifted that by the divine force that is God. Or if you have victory in battle or victory in business, that you have that victory, those victories are attributable to God. And you have them, and it means that you're on God's good side, or something like that. But let's unpack what that might mean for us. So that means if you have lots of luxury mansions and high-end sports cars, and you are in the wealthy 1%, that you have been gifted something from God, whereas everyone else who doesn't have as much hasn't been. If this man wins the Republican nomination, and I hope to God not the presidency, does that mean that his victory is attributable to God? Well, I don't think so. I hope not. So, are we still going to subscribe to this idea? Now, the reverse holds true. If there's an illness, does that mean that you've done something wrong? That you've fallen out of favor with the gods, with God? Or if there's a natural disaster that strikes a nation, does that mean that the nation has done something wrong? I don't think so. So let's first dismantle this idea that children or wealth or victory necessarily means that God is on your side. The other notion that I think we need to dismantle is that it's not just the God of the Old Testament. So we look at these stories and we say, well, that was the Old Testament, and this is the New Testament. And since the New Testament, everything is kind of copacetic. But I'm not sure that makes sense either theologically. Let's play that out. So God has been around since the beginning of time, and only until 2,000 years ago does God get God's act together and figure out that victory for some people and defeat of the others is not the game God wants to be in, and so God chooses a different game. That sounds like a fickle God. It sounds like a God that doesn't match up with our understanding of God. But we still have this story of the displaced Canaanites. These crop growers who worked probably very hard and diligently to get their crops ready to eat, and now they've been pushed off their land, and there are these crops that now the Israelites are eating. So may I suggest two possible ways of looking at this text. The first one is that this is an example of the beginning of a cycle of violence. This is a very political, economic way of looking at the story. Think about it from the standpoint of the Canaanites. If you're a Canaanite, you've worked all year to get these crops up from the ground. You're excited for the possibility that you're actually going to be able to live through the winter. And somebody comes in and kicks you off your land, and now what are you going to do? Well, you're going to go and you're going to figure out how you're going to get through the winter, and when you finally settle down, what are you going to do next? You're probably going to plot revenge. you're going to look back and think, those people who took my land, I'm going back to get it. It sounds like a stretch, but I actually don't think it's far from the truth. See, from this moment on, all the way through the book of Judges, guess who the Israelites are fighting? The Canaanites. They meet them again and again in battle. I don't think that's a coincidence. The second lesson might be this. The metaphor of victory over enemies is still a very real concept. Let me give you an example. In Lord of the Rings, right, there's Bilbo Baggins, and he's adopted by a bunch of dwarves to go to this mountain where there's a dragon and a bunch of treasure. And some very friendly elves come along the way, and there's Gandalf and some other friendly wizard types. And then there's the whole evil side, right? There's the orcs, there's the dragon Smaug. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch of other kind of fairy tale stereotypes in there. When it comes down to it, who are you cheering for in the story? Like when an orc gets hit by an arrow, or you think, oh, poor orc. No, you think, yeah, Bilbo and team, right? So this big victory, this big battle happens, and we think, well, I'm glad that the good people won. We're cheering for this little hobbit. When the dragon gets killed, spoiler alert, we're happy, right? This evil dragon who's been hoarding all this thing and burning up villages is gone. So victory over our enemies is still meaningful to us today. I think it plays out when cancer treatments, for example. What language do we use when somebody has cancer? We say, they are fighting a battle. They are fighting a battle. And when somebody beats cancer, when it goes into remission, when they're declared cancer-free, we say they've won. And when they die of cancer, we say they've lost the battle. Now, what I would say is that there are many people who have cancer, and then out of that experience, have some sort of revelation, have some sort of epiphany. Maybe they're in a job that they don't want to do. Or maybe they have neglected time with their family. And so out of the process of dealing with this disease, their lives are changed, and they are able to eat of the produce of that victory. And so I wonder if that's the lesson in it. I'm not entirely convinced. I think it's still a text we will have trouble with. But I want to ask this question. Have you ever overcome a battle against an enemy and then eaten the fruits of that victory? Maybe it's a battle against an addiction. Maybe it's a battle against the voices in your head that are telling you you're not good enough. Have you ever overcome a battle against an enemy and tasted the fruits of that victory? I'll actually open it up for a moment. Does a story come to mind for any of you? Well, may this be a question that we wrestle with this week. Amen.